They sat in a converted conference room in the Navy Ministry building in Tokyo, surrounded by documents that would change everything. It was late October, 1941. Outside, the city moved through its evening routines, unaware that in this room, a small group of engineers and naval planners were reviewing calculations that should have stopped the war before it started. The room smelled of cigarette smoke and weak tea. Maps covered one wall, showing the Pacific Basin, the resources of Southeast Asia, the shipping lanes that connected Japan's empire. On the tables lay reports, thick binders of intelligence gathered over years, painstakingly assembled data about American industrial capacity. Commander Tomioka Sadatoshi, a staff officer in the Navy General Staff, was presenting findings from the latest analysis of American steel production. The numbers seemed manageable. American steel output, according to their intelligence, stood at approximately 12 million tons annually. Japan produced about 7 million tons. The Americans had more, certainly, but not overwhelmingly more, not impossibly more. With access to resources in Manchuria, Korea, and soon the Dutch East Indies, Japan could close that gap. The war, if it came, would be decided by fighting spirit, by tactical brilliance, by the superiority of Japanese naval aviation. Steel production was just one factor among many. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know because the error was already baked into every report they'd received, was that they were wrong by a factor of 10. American steel production in 1941 was not 12 million tons. It was 88 million tons. Somewhere in the chain of intelligence gathering, in the translation of documents, or the transcription of figures, or the analysis of industrial reports, a decimal point had moved. The mistake had propagated through every subsequent analysis, every strategic calculation, every assessment of whether Japan could sustain a war against the United States. This was not a small error. This was not a rounding difference or a matter of counting methods. This was the difference between fighting an opponent slightly larger than yourself and fighting an opponent who could produce 8 times more steel than your entire empire. It was the difference between a calculated risk and national suicide. And no one in that room in October 1941 knew they had made this mistake. The meeting continued. Officers discussed shipping tonnage, oil reserves, aluminum production. They talked about American isolationism, about the embargo that was strangling Japan's oil supply, about the need to seize the resources of Southeast Asia before the window of opportunity closed. They talked about war as though it were something Japan could win, or at least fight, to a negotiated settlement. They were planning for a conflict based on intelligence that was fundamentally, catastrophically wrong. Understanding how this happened requires understanding how Japan gathered intelligence about American industry in the years before the war, and why those numbers seemed plausible to experienced officers who should have known better. It requires understanding what Japan's own industrial capacity looked like and what assumptions Japanese planners made about industrial warfare. Most importantly, it requires understanding the psychology of men who wanted to believe certain things, who needed to believe them, because the alternative was admitting that the war they were contemplating was unwinnable from the start. Japan's intelligence about American industrial capacity came from multiple sources. Naval attachés stationed in the United States filed reports based on published statistics, trade journals, and direct observation. The reports were professional, detailed, and in many cases accurate about specific facilities or specific products. Commercial representatives gathered information about steel mills, shipyards, and manufacturing plants under the cover of legitimate business activities. Academic researchers translated American technical publications and industrial surveys. The Foreign Ministry compiled data from newspapers, government reports, and economic analyses. The problem was not lack of information. The problem was interpretation, translation, and the subtle ways that cognitive bias shaped how that information was processed and presented to decision-makers. American steel production statistics in the late 1930s were published openly. The American Iron and Steel Institute released annual reports. Trade publications discussed production capacity, new facilities, and technological improvements. This wasn't secret information requiring espionage. It was public data that anyone could access. But that data had to be gathered, translated into Japanese, converted from American units of measurement to metric tons, compiled into reports, and presented to officers who would use it for strategic planning. At each stage, there were opportunities for error. A figure transcribed incorrectly. A conversion calculation performed wrong. A translator misunderstanding technical terminology. A junior officer simplifying data for presentation to superiors. The intelligence apparatus was not designed to double-check fundamental assumptions about enemy industrial capacity because those assumptions seemed reasonable. They seemed reasonable because Japanese planners were working from their own frame of reference. Japan's steel production had grown dramatically in the 1930s. In 1930, Japan produced 2.3 million tons of steel. By 1937, production had nearly tripled to 6.6 million tons. This was impressive growth, the result of massive investment in heavy industry, technological improvements, and access to iron ore and coal from captured territories in China and Manchuria. From a Japanese perspective, doubling steel production in less than a decade seemed like an enormous achievement. It was an enormous achievement. It represented fundamental changes in Japan's industrial base, the construction of new mills, the training of skilled workers, the development of supply chains for raw materials. Officers who had watched this transformation, who had seen Japan modernize its industry at breathtaking speed, had a mental model of what rapid industrial growth looked like. When they looked at American production figures and saw numbers that suggested the United States produced perhaps 50 to 70% more steel than Japan, that seemed plausible. America was a larger country with more resources, certainly, but Japan had momentum, had modern facilities, had workers who were told they were building the industrial foundation of a great East Asia co-prosperity sphere. The gap seemed closeable, especially with access to the resources of Southeast Asia. What Japanese intelligence had failed to capture, what seemed impossible to believe, even when the numbers were presented correctly, was the sheer scale of American industrial infrastructure. The United States Steel Corporation alone, a single company, operated facilities that dwarfed Japan's entire national steel industry. The Gary Works in Indiana, built starting in 1906, covered over 1,500 acres. At peak production, this one facility could produce 7 million tons of steel annually. That was almost as much as Japan's entire national output. The Homestead Steel Works in Pennsylvania, operated by Carnegie Steel before becoming part of U.S. Steel, had been producing steel since 1881. By 1940, it employed over 15,000 workers and could produce over 2 million tons annually. The Edgar Thomson Steel Works, also in Pennsylvania, added another 1.5 million tons. These were not new facilities built in a crash program. They were established operations that had been refining their processes for decades. Bethlehem Steel, U.S. Steel's primary competitor, operated the Bethlehem Steel Plant in Pennsylvania and the Sparrows Point facility in Maryland. Sparrows Point alone covered over 2,000 acres and employed over 30,000 workers. It had its own port, its own railroad network, its own power generation. It could produce 4 million tons of steel per year. The facility had blast furnaces that were larger than any in Japan, rolling mills that could process steel at rates Japanese engineers considered impossible. Republic Steel, the third largest producer, operated mills in Ohio, Pennsylvania, Indiana, and Alabama. National Steel had facilities in Michigan, Inland Steel in Indiana, Jones and Laughlin in Pennsylvania, Youngstown Sheet and Tube in Ohio. These were not small operations. Each of these companies had multiple facilities, each facility employing thousands of workers, each producing hundreds of thousands or millions of tons of steel annually. The scale was not just in the size of individual facilities, but in the integration and efficiency of the entire system. American steel mills in 1940 were supplied by an extensive network of iron ore mines in Minnesota's Mesabi Range, coal mines in Pennsylvania and West Virginia, and limestone quarries across the Midwest. The Great Lakes shipping system moved iron ore from Minnesota to steel mills in Indiana, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, with an efficiency that had no parallel in Japan. Ore boats on the Great Lakes could carry 10,000 to 15,000 tons of iron ore per trip. The loading and unloading infrastructure at ports like Duluth, Superior, and Cleveland was designed for rapid turnaround. An ore boat could be loaded in a few hours, make the trip across Lake Superior and down through the lower lakes, and be unloaded in similar time. The system moved tens of millions of tons of ore annually, feeding the blast furnaces that consumed raw materials at rates Japanese planners found difficult to comprehend. Japanese steel production, by contrast, was concentrated in a handful of facilities. The Imperial Iron and Steel Works at Yawata in Kyushu was Japan's largest and most modern facility, built starting in 1897, with technology initially imported from Germany and later developed domestically. By 1940, Yawata could produce approximately 2 million tons of steel annually. This made it roughly comparable to a single mid-sized American facility like Edgar Thomson, Japan Steel Works in Muroran, Hokkaido, added capacity. Facilities in Manchuria at Anshan and Bengsi provided additional production using iron ore from local mines and coal from Manchurian fields. But even counting production from occupied territories, Japan's total capacity remained around 7 to 8 million tons annually. The entire Japanese empire, stretching from Manchuria to the home islands, produced less steel than the state of Pennsylvania. The intelligence failure was not just about raw numbers. It was about understanding what those numbers meant for sustained industrial warfare. Steel production was the foundation of everything else. Ships required steel for hulls, armor, and structural components. Aircraft required steel for engines, landing gear, and structural frames. Tanks were steel, artillery pieces were steel, ammunition required steel for shell casings, railroad locomotives and freight cars were steel, trucks were steel. The tools to build all of these things were made of steel. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. When Japanese planners estimated they could close the gap in steel production by capturing resources in Southeast Asia, they were calculating based on flawed baseline numbers. If America produced 12 million tons and Japan produced 7 million, then securing an additional 5 million tons of productive capacity from seized territory would achieve parity. The math was simple. The assumption was that controlling iron ore deposits in Malaya and the Philippines, coal in Indochina, and industrial facilities in occupied China would provide that additional capacity. But if America actually produced 88 million tons, then Japan needed to find and develop 81 million tons of additional capacity to reach parity. That was impossible. That required building dozens of new steel mills, each as large as Yawata, each supplied with ore and coal and limestone, each staffed with thousands of trained workers, each equipped with blast furnaces and rolling mills and finishing equipment that Japan's industrial base could not produce in sufficient quantity. The error compounded through every subsequent calculation. Naval planners estimated ship construction capacity based on steel availability. If the baseline assumption about American steel production was wrong by a factor of 10, then estimates of how many ships America could build were wrong by roughly the same factor. Aircraft production estimates were wrong. Tank production estimates were wrong. The entire strategic calculation about whether Japan could sustain a prolonged war against the United States was built on a foundation of incorrect data. Evidence suggests that some Japanese officers had access to more accurate figures, but either did not believe them or did not successfully communicate their importance to decision-makers. Captain Yamamoto Isoroku, who would become admiral and commander of the combined fleet, had served as a naval attaché in Washington from 1925 to 1927. He had traveled extensively in the United States, visiting industrial facilities and observing American production capacity firsthand. Yamamoto understood American industrial power in a way that many of his colleagues did not. He had seen the automobile factories in Detroit, the steel mills in Pittsburgh, the oil refineries in Texas. He knew that American productive capacity was enormous. When asked about the prospects for war with the United States, he reportedly said that Japan could run wild for 6 months to a year, but after that, he had no confidence in ultimate victory. This was not defeatism. This was realism based on direct observation of American industry. But Yamamoto's warnings, to the extent they were heeded at all, were interpreted as caution about American potential rather than acknowledgement of immediate, overwhelming superiority. Other officers who had not seen American industry firsthand found it easier to believe the intelligence reports that suggested a more manageable disparity. Cognitive bias played a role. Officers wanted to believe the war was winnable because the alternative was accepting that Japan's strategic position was hopeless, that the embargo and diplomatic pressure would continue indefinitely, and that Japan would have to either submit to American demands or fight a war it could not win. The moment of recognition, when Japanese planners began to understand the true scale of the error, did not come all at once. It came in pieces, through accumulating evidence that something was fundamentally wrong with their assumptions. The first hints appeared in 1942, after the initial phase of Japanese expansion had succeeded beyond expectations. The attacks on Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies had gone largely according to plan. Japanese forces controlled vast territories and resources. But as occupation authorities began surveying captured industrial facilities and attempting to integrate them into Japanese production, the numbers did not add up. Captured steel mills in the Philippines had limited capacity. Facilities in Malaya were primarily for processing and shipping raw ore, not finished steel production. The Dutch East Indies had oil, rubber, and other resources, but minimal heavy industrial capacity. The additional steel production that planners had counted on to close the gap with America did not materialize in quantities that made strategic difference. Simultaneously, reports from intelligence officers monitoring American production began painting a different picture. Aerial reconnaissance photographs of American shipyards showed construction activity that exceeded Japanese estimates. Reports from neutral observers and diplomatic sources mentioned production figures that seemed impossibly high. American newspapers, which continued to publish industrial statistics even during wartime, reported steel production numbers that were far larger than Japanese intelligence had estimated. At first, these reports were dismissed as propaganda or exaggeration. Newspapers were known to inflate claims for morale purposes. Surely the figures were aspirational goals rather than actual production. But the reports kept coming, from multiple independent sources, and they were consistent. American steel production in 1942 was reported at over 80 million tons. In 1943, it exceeded 90 million tons. These numbers seemed absurd to officers who had planned the war based on estimates of 12 million tons. The full scope of the intelligence failure became undeniable when Japanese forces began encountering American equipment in quantities that could not be explained by the estimated production capacity. At Guadalcanal, beginning in August 1942, American forces demonstrated a capacity to sustain operations with a flow of supplies and equipment that Japanese commanders found inexplicable. Ships arrived continuously. Aircraft were replaced as fast as they were lost. Artillery ammunition was expended at rates that seemed wasteful but never ran out. Japanese forces on Guadalcanal were fighting a war of attrition, where they were being outproduced and outsupplied by margins that made tactical victories meaningless. The Tokyo Express, the nighttime destroyer runs that brought supplies and reinforcements to Japanese forces, delivered hundreds of tons of supplies per mission. American cargo ships and transport vessels delivered thousands of tons per ship, and they came in continuous streams. The mathematical reality became impossible to ignore. America was not just producing more, it was producing an order of magnitude more. Naval construction provided the clearest evidence. Japanese intelligence had estimated that America could build perhaps 50 to 70 merchant ships per year, based on known shipyard capacity and assumptions about steel availability. In 1942, American shipyards launched over 500 merchant vessels. In 1943, They launched over 1900. The Liberty ship program alone, using prefabricated sections and assembly line techniques adapted from automobile manufacturing, produced ships faster than they could be sunk by submarines. The Liberty ships were not sophisticated vessels. They were simple, standardized cargo ships of 10,000 tons displacement, designed for rapid construction rather than longevity or speed. The record for fastest construction was set at the Richmond shipyard in California, where the SS Robert E. Peary was built in 4 days and 15 hours from keel laying to launch. This was a publicity stunt, not normal practice, but it demonstrated the capability of American industrial methods. Normal Liberty ship construction took between 40 to 60 days from start to finish. 18 shipyards participated in the program, employing hundreds of thousands of workers, many of them women who had never worked in heavy industry before. The ships used welding instead of riveting, reducing construction time. They used prefabricated sections built inland and transported to shipyards for assembly. They used standardized components that could be mass-produced and installed quickly. The entire program was designed around the principle that America's advantage was in industrial production, not in building elegant or sophisticated vessels. By 1943, American shipyards were launching 3 new merchant ships every day. Japan's entire merchant fleet at the start of the war totaled approximately 6 million tons. In 1943 alone, America built over 19 million tons of merchant shipping. The disparity was so extreme that it changed the fundamental nature of the war. Japan was fighting to preserve shipping from submarine attacks, carefully routing convoys, rationing cargo space for critical military supplies. America was building ships faster than Germany, and Japan combined could sink them, using those ships to transport overwhelming quantities of men and material across both oceans. Naval combat vessels showed similar disparities. The Essex-class aircraft carrier program, authorized before the war began, produced ships at a rate that Japanese planners had considered impossible. The first carrier, USS Essex, was commissioned in December 1942. By the end of 1945, 17 Essex-class carriers had been commissioned, with more under construction when the war ended. Each carrier displaced over 30,000 tons and required approximately 15,000 tons of steel for construction. The program consumed more steel than Japan's entire annual production, and it was just one ship program among many. Japanese naval construction, by contrast, slowed dramatically as the war continued. The Yamato-class battleships, the largest ever built, consumed enormous resources. Yamato and Musashi together used approximately 140,000 tons of steel in their construction. They represented a strategic philosophy that emphasized quality and fighting power of individual ships. In a war decided by production capacity, this philosophy was ruinous. The steel used for these 2 battleships could have built dozens of destroyers, hundreds of aircraft, thousands of trucks. The battleships themselves achieved little of strategic value before both were sunk by American aircraft. The industrial disparity extended beyond steel to every category of war material. Aluminum production, essential for aircraft manufacturing, showed similar ratios. American aluminum production in 1943 exceeded 800,000 tons. Japanese production was approximately 90,000 tons. The ratio was nearly 10 to 1, the same as steel. This translated directly into aircraft production. America built nearly 96,000 aircraft in 1943. Japan built approximately 16,000. American production exceeded Japanese production by a factor of 6, and American aircraft were generally larger, heavier, and used more aluminum per unit. Oil production told the same story. The United States produced over 4 million barrels of oil per day in 1943. Japan's domestic production was approximately 30,000 barrels per day, supplemented by captured oil fields in the Dutch East Indies that added perhaps 60,000 barrels per day when operating at capacity and when shipping was available to transport it. The ratio was over 40 to 1. Every aspect of industrial warfare, from the steel in ships to the aluminum in aircraft to the oil that powered everything, showed the same pattern of overwhelming American superiority. The psychological impact on Japanese planners who came to understand the true scale of the disparity was profound, and in many cases documented in post-war interrogations and memoirs. These were intelligent, educated men who had devoted their careers to military planning. They understood logistics, industrial capacity, and military strategy. Discovering that their fundamental assumptions about enemy production capacity were wrong by an order of magnitude was not just professionally devastating, it was personally shattering. Some officers retreated into denial, arguing that American equipment was wasteful or inferior, that Japanese fighting spirit would compensate for material disadvantages, that one Japanese soldier was worth 10 Americans. These arguments became increasingly hollow as the war progressed, and the material imbalance translated into unbroken American advances across the Pacific. Other officers acknowledged the reality privately, but could not say so publicly, without being accused of defeatism or disloyalty. Captain Omei Toshikazu, a staff officer who worked on operational planning throughout the war, wrote in his post-war memoirs about the growing recognition that Japan could not win a war of attrition. He described meetings where officers discussed logistical sustainability and came to understand that every battle, even victories, depleted Japanese resources that could not be replaced. American forces could lose battles and come back stronger. Japanese forces won battles and came back weaker because losses in ships, aircraft, and experienced personnel were irreplaceable. The recognition changed strategic thinking in subtle but important ways. By 1944, Japanese defensive planning shifted from attempting to defeat American attacks to inflicting maximum casualties in hopes of making the war so costly that America would negotiate a settlement. The strategy of decisive battle, which had dominated Japanese naval thinking since the Russo-Japanese War, gave way to attrition warfare. But attrition warfare requires the ability to replace losses, and Japan could not replace losses at remotely comparable rates to America. The kamikaze attacks that began in October 1944 were born from this recognition of material inferiority. If conventional attacks on American ships required aircraft, bombs, and trained pilots who could return to fight again, and if Japan could not sustain that model against American production capacity, then attacks that sacrificed the pilot along with the aircraft became a way to maximize damage per sortie. The logic was brutal but mathematically sound given the constraints Japan faced. Each kamikaze that hit an American ship caused damage that required American resources to repair. Each kamikaze that missed was still a smaller resource expenditure than the conventional attack it replaced. The strategy failed not because the logic was wrong, but because the production disparity was too extreme. American shipyards could repair damaged vessels faster than kamikazes could damage them. American aircraft factories could build replacement planes faster than Japan could train pilots. American industrial capacity could absorb losses that would have crippled Japan. The problem remained unchanged. Japan was fighting an industrial war against an opponent whose industrial capacity was 10 times larger. For the engineers and planners who had made the original intelligence error, the recognition must have been crushing. Their miscalculation had contributed to strategic decisions that led Japan into a war it could not win. Officers who had sat in meetings in October 1941 reviewing reports that showed American steel production at 12 million tons, who had argued that Japan could compete, who had supported the decision to go to war, came to understand that they had been catastrophically wrong. The decimal point error, wherever it originated in the intelligence chain, had propagated through every strategic assessment and contributed to national catastrophe. Primary source documents from late war planning meetings show a marked change in tone. Early war documents are confident, discussing timetables for operations and expected outcomes. Late war documents are defensive, discussing how long various positions can be held and how many casualties can be inflicted before inevitable defeat. The shift reflected growing recognition that the war was unwinnable, that it had always been unwinnable, and that the initial assessment of relative industrial capacity had been fundamentally flawed. Post-war interrogations conducted by American intelligence officers revealed the extent to which Japanese officers had misunderstood American industrial capacity. One interrogation report from December 1945 quotes a former naval planning officer who stated that Japanese estimates of American production capacity were not in the same universe as reality. Another officer, when shown American steel production figures, initially refused to believe them, arguing they must include some form of double counting or error. When assured the figures were accurate, he reportedly sat in silence for several minutes before saying that if he had known these numbers in 1941, he would have resigned his commission rather than participate in planning a war. The intelligence failure at the heart of Japan's strategic miscalculation was not simply a matter of wrong numbers. It was a failure of imagination, an inability to conceive of industrial capacity on the scale that America had developed. Japanese officers who had spent careers working within the constraints of Japan's limited industrial base found it difficult to believe that any nation could produce steel at rates 10 times higher. The numbers seemed impossible because they were outside the frame of reference that Japanese experience provided. American industrial capacity in World War II represented something historically unprecedented. The United States in 1943 produced more steel than Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. It produced more aluminum than the rest of the world combined. It built more ships, aircraft, tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces than all Axis powers together. This was not just quantitative superiority, it was a qualitative change in what industrial warfare meant. Previous wars had been constrained by industrial capacity. World War II, for America, was constrained primarily by logistics of moving material to where it was needed. The decimal point error, whether it was a single mistake or a systematic failure in intelligence gathering and analysis, symbolizes the broader failure of Japanese strategic thinking before the war. Japan entered a conflict against an opponent whose industrial capacity was so much greater that the war was unwinnable from the start. The miscalculation was not just about steel production. It was about failing to understand what modern industrial warfare required and what America's industrial economy could sustain. Officers sitting in a conference room in Tokyo in October 1941, reviewing intelligence reports that showed American steel production at 12 million tons, made decisions based on incomplete and incorrect information. Those decisions led to attacks on Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, and across the Pacific. They led to initial victories that created the illusion of Japanese military superiority. And they led, inevitably, to defeat as American industrial capacity translated into overwhelming material superiority on every battlefield. The men in that room were not fools. They were experienced officers working with the information available to them. But the information was wrong, fundamentally and catastrophically wrong. And by the time the error became apparent, by the time Japanese forces encountered American equipment in quantities that made the intelligence failure undeniable, it was too late to change course. The war would continue for 4 more years, consuming millions of lives, destroying cities, and ending with atomic weapons used against Japanese civilians. All of it might have been avoided if someone, somewhere in the intelligence chain, had caught the error before it became the foundation for strategic planning. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.